for any of the following reasons. A, if the city or town has an approved affordable housing plan and is meeting housing needs and the proposal is inconsistent with the affordable housing plan. B, the proposal is not consistent with local needs, including but not limited to the needs identified in an approved comprehensive plan and/or local zoning ordinances and procedures promulgated in conformance with the comprehensive plan. C, the proposal is not in conformance with the comprehensive plan. D, the community has met or has planned to meet the goal of 10% of the year-round units, or, in the case of an urban town or city, 15% of the occupied rental housing units as defined in 45-53(3)(2)I, being low and moderate income housing, or E, concerns for the environment and the health and safety of current residents have not been adequately addressed. So those are the requirements, but I think that since this is a complex project with lots of comments and concerns, even if you feel that they are somewhat repetitive based on what Jamie has put in his findings, and again, this doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with his conclusions, but the findings as outlined in the memo are, I think, of particular relevance. So, and Jamie will be taking notes as we speak. Who would like to start? It doesn't have to be just one person, you know, people jump right in.
I'm still concerned on water supply. So I recall a letter from Viola saying that they could supply enough water. I don't know whether that was for the original restaurant plan or how that would compare with the apartment building, knowing that South Kingston has had water shortages recently. I think that we should look at that. Secondly, I don't think I understand the road access situation well enough. That how is this really going to work for those people, and how is the traffic flow going to change? If you had light industry, let's say, then there was probably an entering and an exit time of day, not a constant flow. So I think that also needs to be reported out on with current. And I know you've mentioned current traffic flow. Yes, and I really need to better understand how that road's going to work for those people, because that is our job, to protect them, that they are neighbors of a development, and like they said, they bought those condominiums before there was any thought of residential use of the property.
Liz?
To speak further to what Robin just said, one of the comments here that Jamie put forth is safe circulation or pedestrian and vehicular traffic. I think it's really important that we look at the pedestrian circulation as well as the vehicular traffic for the people in that apartment building. I mean, how are they going to get around once they leave the building? It seems to me they have a sea of parking around them. And then, of course, there's the issue of how do they get to Tower Hill Road, if they're Old Tower Hill Road, if their employment is there or they want bus service from there. So I think it's not just vehicular traffic, but pedestrian traffic as well. And then the other thing that I brought up before is the issue of attractiveness of the building. Attractiveness is such a strange word. It's such an arbitrary word. But the appropriateness, I think, is better, and the appropriateness of the appearance of this apartment building to the rest of the community architecture. I think that's something that needs a good, hard look at.
Thanks.
A couple of questions, and I'm going to jump to conditions of approval. So I'm looking at condition of approval 1E, construct a structure not to exceed maximum height and square footage allowed by the regulations. Does that mean something smaller than has been proposed, or?
So right now the regulations have a maximum height, but they allow 1 foot to increase as you're set back from Route 1. So again, based on their ability to park. It is recommended to be a smaller building of 37 units, so I don't know how tall the building is proposed to be. Therefore, it was staff's recommendation that they attempt to adhere to the height restrictions contained within the regulations, with the notion that it's a 37-unit building, not a 70-unit building.
The other question I have is on condition 6. Applicant shall research walking paths connecting the proposed development to the villages at South County Commons and Old Tower Hill Road and present findings. Is there a way to strengthen that language? I mean, I think what I would like to see is that the applicant has created a conceptual plan and run it through DEM pre-application, just to talk with the wetlands folks and also with DOT permitting staff to see what's feasible. I mean, basically what I'm looking for is something from DOT and/or DEM saying, no, this will never happen.
We can work on language. to
Jay's
that effect.
shaking his head, so.
Well, I think what you're asking for is something that is primarily preliminary plan material and
Okay.
not where we're at now. Because you're asking for an in-depth
But this would be a condition that they meet at preliminary.
at preliminary.
Yeah.
That's
Preliminary.
totally,
Yeah.
that would be a given anyway.
Okay.
And again, I anticipated, or my expectations were that you would want to clarify the words, shall research. Again, it's an off-site improvement. It's within a DOT right-of-way or on private lands, so their ability to make said improvements will be under the control of other regulatory authorities or landowners.
And just going back to what Maria just read out loud, did I hear that this needs to be on a public road? And if so, that's something that we can waive as it's a common?
There isn't a need to be on a public road. What the regulations state that it needs to have access
Access
to
to.
a public road. So it doesn't need to have, they have frontage
Right.
on a limited access driveway. Actually, they don't. There's a property between them. But again, the terminology and the language is access to. And they are provided information regarding their easement, whether that was refuted by the butter's legal representation. But they have provided in their application a recorded deed addressing easement issues.
And last question, there's a lot in here about parking and various plans that have been submitted over the years. Is it safe to say that if, in fact, we do end up with a 70-unit apartment building fully parked, then the restaurant pad is off the table?
So I'll do my best to answer that, Mr. Jordan. I think the difficulty we had as your staff in working with legal counsel is you have District 5. And District 5 originally was composed of, for discussion purposes, 4 parcels. The school and then the land south of the school. The developer proposed in District 5 to have the school, in essence, as a standalone parcel that had access to Route 1, at least frontage, but not direct access in the form of a driveway. They actually relocated their driveway to the existing school to be the current location of the main drive to this proposed development, as well as Wakefield Meadows and the office complex to the south. In the development of District 5, they originally proposed a restaurant/bank, a hotel, and then a second restaurant to the west. That was amended to be a restaurant on the east, a hotel in the middle, and a restaurant on the west. Their council made it clear to staff that the restaurant on the east that was approved by the planning board and recorded as a final plan approval in the land records of the town was not part of this application, nor did they have the ability to eliminate, nor were they willing to vest themselves of that right to build that restaurant. So the difficulty is if you made any favorable motion for a 70-unit apartment complex and a hotel, you in essence took away the parking for the restaurant that their attorney said you don't have control over in this application process. So staff worked again with legal with regards to the vetted interest of that restaurant. It is a recorded approval, and then that recorded approval requires 50 parking spaces. The whole, per regulations, and that's what was approved. The applicant in their approval site plan showed the count for 50 spaces for that restaurant. The hotel required 117. They were providing 106. They had 34 overflow spaces associated with the restaurant and hotel, and they were parking the restaurant west at 78 spaces. So that was the original approval. When they came back in, they proposed parking for the hotel at 135. The regulations required 117, so they're compliant with their hotel parking as part of this proposal. But with the apartment complex, the regulations required 2 spaces per unit, which would have been 140 spaces. They suggested 1.5 and requested a waiver of your parking standards. There was testimony from both the public as well as Mr. Murphy as a member of the planning board and a apartment owner, multiple units, who testified that he did not feel that 1.5 was sufficient. So in our draft motion for you, we were making the recommendation that in this development proposal, that you cannot discount the existing approved restaurant. That requires 50 spaces. The hotel requires 117, and to fully park the proposed apartment complex at 2 spaces, you don't have enough spaces in their 241 proposed to accommodate everything. The hotel exists, the restaurant in essence exists through approval, so the only way to deal with the parking count was to reduce the unit count. And that's how we arrived at 37 units,
So that height,
fully parked per the reg. So 2 spaces per unit in the apartment complex, 117 for the hotel, and 50 for the approved restaurant.
thank you.
I have a few comments, but they're not,
And I did that all from memory, so if I'm off by one, I'll apologize.
yeah, I'm just going to, and then we'll just keep going. I mean, this is why we're having this special meeting, so that everybody can talk and discuss what the issues are and where we feel we should be going with this. And I think that it's important to state that this planning board, despite what has been, I would say, articulated by applicants, this planning board is not against affordable housing. This planning board has approved multiple comprehensive permits, despite the fact that they were not necessarily in line with areas within our subdivision regulations and our zoning ordinance. We have, in those cases, attempted to create enough conditions so that with those required conditions, the projects could move forward even if they were not necessarily best planning practices. So one of the differences between some of those projects and this one is that residential is not allowed in this particular district. It has been made clear from comments going back to the initial beginning of the Special Management District, of which I was well aware, I was on the board at that point, that the town was interested in creating a district that had various types of uses, specifically those for commercial, light industrial type uses. Obviously, a significant amount of residential uses have been allowed within the district as a whole. So we've gotten to this point where the majority of the district has been built out, and there are restrictions that were put in for very specific reasons by the South Kingstown Town Council. I think that we need to kind of think about one of the complicating issues with this is that the applicant didn't really have enough of a dialogue with the planning board. There were 2 meetings in which the applicant was not present, although they could have used those meetings to communicate with the board. And it's not as though the board was asking for an inordinate amount of open space and multiple recreation facilities or anything of that nature. I think there needs to be a degree of certainty in the town regulations. The board has, from the onset, had a greater degree of authority within the special management district than in other areas of the town. For example, architectural review, signage, buffering, and so on. We've had much greater degree of authority with regard to that. I am concerned that the concerns and comments from the public and the planning board have been disregarded. We have not had any kind of really conversation with regard to that. That is very unfortunate because having a dialogue and trying to work together with an applicant usually results in a better project as a whole. Our local needs are very well reflected in our ordinances and in our comprehensive plan. I have a few things that I want to read from the comprehensive plan. One is related to within our housing element, which discusses village center development and the idea of having any kind of concentration of future development in the 4 villages best equipped to handle the growth. Each of these villages is truly unique with regard to the opportunities and constraints associated with future development, and the community will carefully assess future opportunities against the individual conditions within each village. Under land use elements, policy 1.4, utilize policies and regulatory tools to support and maintain quality housing opportunities and sustainable residential development that is accessible by all populations, ages, abilities, and modes of transportation. Also under land use, neo-traditional planning techniques intended to enhance and improve sense of place, support of multimodal transportation, and incorporate village-appropriate green spaces are appropriate for the village areas. Appropriate development in the village areas is of a scale and mass with architectural design and site planning that creates visual interest, activates the streetscape, and encourages walking, biking, and transit use. Under land use goals, high standards of development will be required to preserve and enhance the quality of life, to encourage a sense of community, to support a healthy, walkable environment, and to protect the natural resources of the town. Guiding principles. The purpose of land use planning is to balance the needs and aspirations of the community with the rights of private property owners. South Kingstown's village character and natural resources must be protected and enhanced. This can be done through land use regulations, design guidelines, environmental protection, site planning, and landscaping regulations. The existing village areas are unique, each with their own identity and sense of place. The distinct characteristics must be protected and enhanced when planning for appropriate growth. I'll let other folks talk a little bit more because I think there is a lot here. You know, we have, again, been concerned about the auto-centric nature of this design. In fact, it's exclusionary due to that particular factor with regard of the limited access highway and the need for having a vehicle. Obviously, parking is a large concern since they are taking parking from another already approved different use project and utilizing it for this. So although we can nitpick about the design itself, the fact that it's not an allowed use is the initial concern that I have. Joe? Or Susan, whoever wants to.
I think changes to a master plan should not be taken lightly. This becomes more and more significant as time passes, as neighboring property owners invest into that community. As phases get built out of that area and the planning that goes into it, we're told as planners to be consistent with the town's comprehensive plan. Be consistent with our approvals and be consistent with our disapprovals. And I think there's good reason for that. When we evaluate a project, we should not be making our approval or disapproval based on the whims of the night and whether we find that project necessarily favorable or unfavorable at that particular moment. Rather, we should be looking at a long line of planning, a long line of notification to neighboring property owners, what was be reasonably expected based on notices provided of an applicant, what they can or what they can't do with that property. The master plan here specifically called out that residential could not be used or could not be in that area. This board has reviewed several elements of the build-out since that master plan went in place. Had residential been identified, the circulation of that area would have been different. The buffering and the landscape in that area would have been different. The recreational area, the lighting, all this would have been different. The comprehensive, or I should say the Affordable Housing Act allows us to disapprove if the comprehensive plan is not consistent with. I don't know if this master plan is specifically called out in that comprehensive plan or not. However, I can't think of anything more analogous. This plan has been in existence for some time. Our planning as a town has been consistent over some time. The neighbors who invested their land, their money in that housing, did it specifically with what the plans were in place. The applicant, when he bought that land or when he decided to invest in that land, had reasonable expectations of what he could and what he couldn't do with that. I can't think of anything that's more analogous to the comprehensive plan than the master plan. I can't think of anything else that would allow. We have done, this isn't about the whims about this project. This is about planning that's done over many years, specifically to the circulation, the recreation, people that invested in that area, and the reasonable expectations of the applicant. So from my perspective, that changing that master plan, and this is specifically egregious because I don't even think that we had a lot of notice on this master plan, that this master plan had to be changed. I don't even think whatever notice we normally get, whether it's 120 days or 90 days, I think it's been less than that. Some of the biggest, I've heard several concerns from the neighbors. One of the biggest concerns I have is, or that I've heard, was the use of the road, your loss of your privacy. That is, and a lot of that is being driven by the fact that now there would be a change to the master plan. There's a difference in the pedestrian traffic and the vehicle traffic from somebody who lives there and is going to run back and forth to town versus somebody that commutes from maybe out of town to a job site, or somebody that's from out of town to a hotel. I find it very inconsistent with all our planning in the past, the way that area has been built out, the expectations of the neighbors, and the expectation of the applicant to actually allow a change to master plan now, without going through some process, without fully understanding what the impacts are, how those impacts can be mitigated. I'm not necessarily saying I would never change the master plan, but for instance, perhaps a peer review of how the traffic can change or how it could be safely conveyed to the town with other amenities without going through their private property. We don't know that because truth of the matter is there's only been identified recently the change of master plan, and we really haven't had time to review that. So whether this is specifically a change to the town's comprehensive plan, I can think of nothing more analogous. There's nothing else that's given as much notice. So for those reasons, I am at this point against that project. Now, I will say that if the project did go forward, I would have concern about parking, recreational lighting, and all those things that go into good use planning for when you have a commercial alongside with a residential.
Thanks, Joe. Susan?
Well, first I have to say Joe is a really tough act to follow, so that was very well said. Thank you. And actually what Joe just said, and I'm looking at this document that we have today that says, a major change to a previously approved use necessitates planning board review of the entire district to evaluate if and how use functions and is balanced. I guess I'm not understanding how this is rolling through without this revisiting of the master plan. And I guess I'd like an explanation of how we're just sort of skipping this, which I think is good advice, that we need to look at the entire space as a moving unit and not cherry-pick portions to look at. There are a few things about this that I'm concerned with, and some of it I think is for staff, and some of it's just my general commentary. I wonder about the open space requirements and whether or not as a multifamily subdivision, multifamily development, we have open space requirements that haven't been addressed, and there's not room here to address those open space needs. I don't find in this document that we've reviewed any call out that the hotel and the Restaurant East are owned by an entirely separate party. We're sharing traffic, parking back and forth. It's no different than if I told my friends to park on my neighbor's yard. I don't understand why the fact that this is owned by a separate party isn't in neon on the front of this while we're horse trading some parking. It's a separate lot owned by a separate party. We can't picket their parking. They're not even here to talk about it. I think that's almost in itself alone, a deal breaker for me. A number of places in here, it's been mentioned that the application was deemed incomplete. And if the application was deemed incomplete, why aren't we back at the beginning addressing the needs to make it complete before we start discussing it?
Just for clarification, can you be specific about that statement?
Oh,
Where was that, where's that referenced?
okay, you're gonna have to give me a minute because I had it marked on my first version.
It,
Motion?
No, I think it was not in the motion. It was in the text, and it says that the application was deemed incomplete, I think because they hadn't submitted.
so the application was deemed complete. After the application was deemed complete, staff engaged in a conversation with the applicant's engineer regarding density in a yield plan, which at that point, it was determined that we really weren't sure what the density was. In most cases, or in all cases, we have an idea of what the waiver that's being requested is as it relates to density. So without that number, we didn't know, and there was some conflicting information that was relayed to me in regards to what the approved density or allowable density was at the time, which then led me to go back and try to figure it out myself and uncover that this conceptual master plan did not allow residential uses on that, or did not propose residential uses on District 5. So the application was never necessarily incomplete. It was complete. However, that component, the density information, is one piece that it could have been considered incomplete had we known about it earlier. But how do you answer that question without knowing exactly what that number is in regards to density?
Okay, I understand, and I'm going to spend a minute running through this and find, I didn't mark it on this copy. So that's one of the questions I had, so thank you. There's a number of staff comments here that the original plans need to be modified. In order to proceed with current proposal, applicant would need to amend. Was that disregarded? Was there obviously it wasn't amended, so this was a recommendation that staff made to the applicant at some point during the process, that in order to proceed with current proposal, applicant would need to amend. And there's a couple of different things. So but yet we are proceeding with the proposal even though they didn't amend. Yes?
I'll defer to legal, but again, our call-out was an amendment to the district. You did receive a subsequent letter on May 9th addressing that through the applicant's, on my applicant's letterhead from their legal, but I'll defer to counsel on that question.
Yeah, I think generally the issue that was raised here, the issues that you're identifying, which are issues, were caused by the fact that the applicant applied for this application as a new master plan, didn't identify a lot of the issues that were raised, such as the restriction on the 98 master plan, the need to amend, the density, as Jay was referring to. The problem that, the reason it's in front of you, even though they were lacking those things, is because when they came in, they didn't identify them as part of their project, received the certificate of completion of the application. Once they receive that, you have a time clock where it needs to come before the planning board, and you need to vote on it up or down, or else it will be approved by default. So there have been ongoing conversations with the applicant. Jamie did mention there was that May 9th letter, I think it was May 9th, where, they put in the sentence, and to the extent it's needed to want to amend the master plan. There hasn't been a lot on that, but unfortunately, just because of the way the statute is written, the time clock, that gets triggered by the certificate of completion, it needed to come before you for that.
Thank you for that explanation. But I think that if material is not complete or is, I don't want to use the word deceptive, but if they're not disclosing information, I think it's unjust to then start the clock ticking when we don't have all of that data, and only by the good detective work of planning staff did we uncover material that hadn't been disclosed. So it sets a precedent, I think, where if you don't disclose all of your information, but you can start that clock, you can slip stuff past us, that's really, I think, unjust. And I think that's what, that to me feels what's happened here, and it doesn't feel good.
Thanks.
I'm
Paul?
not-
Oh, are you still?
I still have more.
Yeah, that's
You can't
fine.
get rid of me
That's
that
what we're
fast. The density is listed as 8.2 per acre. Is it not developable land, and then there's some other math that happens there?
So we were just, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So with regards to that, if you bear with me, we told you we made a few modifications to that. That reference to 8.2 was based on the total acreage of the site, not the developable acreage. So I believe the developable acreage is 4.53. So just bear with me, I'm trying to get to that section. It's actually revised prior to printing. So if you just bear with me one moment.
Thank you.
It might be helpful for board members to take the revised document from Jamie and actually write page numbers on the pages, so that when we're discussing a particular item, we can make reference to a page number, and then we know
Yeah,
where you're
so
at.
Madam Chair, Jay has the revised text associated with that, section C, or item C. So it should be noted that these 37 units constitutes a density of 8.16 units per acre, assuming a 4.54 acre development of developable land per Dupree Engineering.
I'm sorry,
You just scroll, I don't know where you are on this.
Oh, sorry, page 12,
oh,
item C.
page 12.
No, the last sentence.
And just to clarify, while the recess was happening, staff noticed that, that the calculation of 8.2 or the 8.16, if you use the usable acreage that, that Dupree sent to us, sent to staff in an email after the application had been filed, that the 8.16 units per acre, you get that if it's reduced to the 37. If you were at the 70 units, it would actually be, and I don't think you're gonna find it in the draft motion, because this was just, just a calculation that we were correcting now, but the 70 units would be 15.5 units per acre, using the usable acreage that Dupree provided.
But isn't that how we calculate yield, is by usable acreage?
Yeah, so
So instead of saying 8.2 acres, it ought to say like 16.
15,
All right. Okay.
yes.
Can you just scroll up, because I'm still not finding it. I just numbered my pages, and it's not on page 12.
Page 10.
Ah, it's page 10, that's why. Here it is. Okay, it's highlighted. Thank you. Susan, do you have more comments?
Yep, sorry. All right, I've got more. In the conditions of approval, number 1, right in number 1, it says that we are potentially approving a maximum of 37 total residential units. But I believe that's based on how many parking spaces are available, and I would like to maybe clarify how large or how many bedrooms are contained in 37 units if we're using parking as our mathematical variable here. 37 mansions has different parking requirements than 37 one-bedroom units. Can we clarify, do we need to clarify
So-
how many bedrooms or what size units, or what actually we're approving here?
We can clarify that. Again, in the application, the developer had a mix of 1 to 2 bedroom units. Our intent is on that 37 unit yield to not exceed 2 bedroom units. So we can clarify that.
Okay, thank you. All right. And then lower on that page, on condition 8, H, provide the minimum percentage of non-residential development base associated with commercial uses within the 8 districts. Is that requesting or requiring that they comply with their own determination that 52% of this project would be non-residential, and hereby we are asking them to build some stuff to get it up? Is that, I don't understand the wording of H, and if we're asking them to build industrial or commercial to make that percentage equation balance.
So there is a provision within the original approval for the Village at South County Commons associated with the non-residential versus residential mix. That calculation was not included in this. We're recommending at preliminary that that be included, and if it doesn't meet, they would need to request a waiver.
Okay. To request a waiver to change that percentage, not necessarily to build anything.
They would potentially either need to reduce their unit count or do something to adhere to that original condition of the Village at South County Commons or request a waiver for it.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm almost done. So we have talked about buffers from the neighboring residences, but we've also talked about in the special management district having buffers from Route 1. But the hotel and the restaurant are owned by a separate party. What is our ability to ask for buffers of this apartment from Route 1 across property that doesn't belong to the applicant?
So I'll try and answer that in two ways. We included a provision that the applicant shall adhere to all other permitting and regulatory requirements contained in the town's land use regulations. They did not request any waivers of the buffering or landscape requirements. And there's a buffer requirement within 100 feet of Route 1. There's also a buffer requirement if any building is visible from Route 1. So if they can't accomplish it closer to the road, they'll need to accomplish it on the property they control,
So the buffer would happen between the building and the hotel?
potentially. Again, that's
We
up.
cannot ask the hotel or the restaurant.
You can ask.
We can.
So I think the difficulty is to require a developer to make improvements on property that they've stated they do not control. So that would be an off-site exaction, or again, a delegation away of authority to another landowner, and I've always been advised that is not appropriate.
Right, okay. Almost done.
Doesn't mean they don't have to adhere to a standard just because they don't own the property that it makes the most sense to do it on.
I understand.
There's still a standard they need to adhere to or request a waiver for.
Thank you. I have a question about whether or not we've received any communication from the abutter to the north. Has that been any of the conversation?
The butter being the school.
There was a
I
letter.
know we have no verbal testimony from them. Again,
I'm pretty sure there was a letter at some
I
point.
think there was a letter early on.
And have,
December, January timeframe.
I don't remember that. Did they have, do you recall if they had requests or concerns that we also need to address in our motion?
I believe it was related to buffering.
Buffering between the apartment and the school?
Yes. Again, the condition or recommended condition 8 shall adhere to all other permitting or regulatory requirements contained in the town's land use regulations. They were asking for no relief from any buffer requirements in their original application.
Okay. Sorry, I have one more. And we talked at a previous meeting about that this additional residential units actually is potentially a benefit for our town who's having a housing shortage and an affordable housing shortage, but also a housing shortage. And whether or not it would be reasonable to have these be year-round rentals, because seasonal, academic, or short-term rentals, I think, in my opinion, doesn't do anything to contribute to the town and the needs of our town. And I don't know what our authority is, but short-term rentals or part-year rentals or weekend rentals or whatever this might be, first off, really isn't fair to those families who live there who are in the affordable units, but also does not contribute to any improvement of our housing situation in our town. And so I don't know if we have any authority in that department, but I certainly want it noted that, at least in my opinion, short-term rentals aren't helping anybody in town. And that really would be unfortunate if that's the direction that this project went.
Before legal answers that, we do have a letter from Lifespan dated March 23rd, 2013, addressed to the planning board. The questions they were asking was easements associated with sewer, easements for sewer pumps, sewer service. Sewer pumps need to be coordinated with regards to access to their property, concern about hotel construction and runoff. Has there been a new traffic study? Barriers, separation, and monitoring. Are there any plans by the apartment complex to build fences to keep separation from the school and students and apartment residents from commingling and walking on each other's property? That'd be an issue of trespass. Thank you, Lynn.
That's all I have for now.
Paul, did you have something?
Yeah, just to sort of cut to the chase here. The first sentence of the conditions of approval, it says, "In reviewing the findings of this application, the planning board has determined that a denial of this comprehensive permit application would not be warranted or appropriate, as the findings do not support the requisite findings as required in Rhode Island law." So we have all of this sort of red flags, but then we're told that none of them really fit the bill, and that also what we're actually being asked to approve is conditional approval as an amendment to the 1998 master plan. And so I guess the questions that Joe and Maria have brought up about planning and the comprehensive plan, and item C in Rhode Island General Law 4553-4, the proposal is not in conformance with the comprehensive plan. I'm just wondering where we are with all of that, because again, we have pages and pages here of issues, all of which we're told don't really apply to a comp permit, so.
It's up to the board to really determine that. I mean, we didn't specifically ask staff to write a motion for approval. I certainly thought they were going to write 2 motions, because that had been discussed at an earlier meeting. So it's up to the board to make that decision, and we have the specific requirements that we need to address, and we need to articulate what evidence exists to support those particular findings. I want to reiterate what Joe had to say. I think that this list of findings, to me, represent grounds for denial, and I think they're very thorough and well thought out, and I think we should go through them and then figure out how folks feel about where they belong, whether it's an approval or denial. If it's an approval, what conditions people feel should be part of that, or?
Before you do that, I mean, just
Yep.
to be clear, what we're approving is 37 units, unless
We
some
are
magic parking
putting a
solution appears.
condition in
Right. If we were to approve,
that may, yes,
it would be 37 units, so
Well,
a much smaller,
that's what we might ask for. There's no guarantee
right, that we're going that way, I know.
we're going to, right. So, again, it's, based on again, the proposal not being consistent with local needs, including but not limited to the needs identified in an approved comprehensive plan and/or local zoning ordinances and procedures promulgated in conformance with the comprehensive plan. Not in conformance with the comprehensive plan, concerns for the environment and the health and safety of current residents have not been adequately addressed. I guess at this point, it might be useful to just kind of go around the room and ask board members, before we go through the findings, sort of what their conclusions are, if they have one, as far as should this be a motion for approval of denial.
Maria, can I just have council weigh in on how you apply A through E? Because it's my understanding that in making those findings to deny, that in essence, the need for affordable housing, does it outweigh the needs of the town as it relates to those? Or does the need for affordable housing, because you don't meet the 10% requirement, kind of outweigh?
And Jamie, you
You're
could say that
confident.
about anything, because every time we have a comprehensive permit that has 75% market rate units and 25% affordable units, we are still in the negative numbers, as you know.
You are correct, but I know there's a host of legal aspects that support A through E.
Go ahead, Peter.
So, Jamie, did you just want me on the structure of what a motion would look like?
Well, how they're in the format of the planning board discussing A through E and the reasons to deny, and how that relates to their ability to make such a motion.
Okay, I think you've all seen the draft that was circulated by staff earlier, setting forth the standards. There are standards for required finding, which were discussed earlier, A through G. If you were to make an approval, you need to make a positive finding on each one of those A through G standards. I know in your work sessions, at least I think, Andy Tights has been doing the workshop review of making land use decisions, and so essentially you'd look at the standards A through G, restate it, and then at the end of it you would say because, and add the details in the record that you think support a finding on that. That's what you do for a finding of approval, and if it's going to be an approval with conditions, a lot of the reasons for approval would relate back to those conditions. So, for instance, there's a required finding that there will be no significant negative environmental impacts from the proposed development as shown on final plan with all required conditions for approval. So you would state, if you were making an approval, that you could make a positive finding on that respect because we're putting in these conditions that reduce the impact of the development, and that's how you can make a positive finding. Just reference it for the record. Alternatively, if you were to make a motion to deny, you would need to, one, locate within the findings A through G at least one of those findings that you do not feel a positive finding could be made. So, for instance, the proposed development is consistent with local needs as identified in the local comprehensive community plan, and that's just the first standard. So that would say you would find it's not consistent with the local needs identified in the local comprehensive community plan because, and then state the reasons of record that you feel that finding isn't made. After addressing A through G, you would also need to make a positive finding on the negative factors listed through A through D of the next paragraph. So that's the, A through E. Those are the findings about if the city or town has an approved affordable housing plan and is meeting housing needs, is it inconsistent with the affordable housing plan? And B, whether the proposal is inconsistent with local needs, including the needs identified in the approved comprehensive plan, whether the proposal is not in conformance with the comprehensive community plan, et cetera. So you'd look at those findings, find which one of those, at least one of those findings, you would have to make a positive finding on, even though they're stated in the negative. You would need to find that one of those negative findings are met, and I think Jamie's just about to highlight that paragraph. It's paragraph Roman numeral 7, small Roman numeral 7, right there, a little bit lower. So those are the findings for denial. So in addition to finding that one of those above findings could not be met, you would need to find that one of those negative findings are met in this instance. And then state on the record why you feel that's the case.
Thank you.
Again, we're looking at a conditional approval that cuts the size of the project in half. If it had been initially proposed as 37 units, I mean, I don't want to get hung up on all of the process issues. The comp plans permits are always contentious. This one certainly has been. But we're looking at a conditional approval of half the number of units. I share Susan's concern about short-term rentals. I think we've been told we can't make a requirement in our conditions that they be 12-month rentals. That's something we'll have to solve another day. But I think a lot of the concerns, yes, there are lots of issues with process and prior approvals and prior plans, but the project that we're potentially conditionally approving is half the size. To me, that counts for a lot. I'll leave it at that.
You know that these conditions are more of an ask than anything else, given the process with regard to appeals.
I don't know that, but I feel like if we deny it, it's straight to SHAB tomorrow morning, and if we approve it with conditions, we have more time to.
But if we're always fearful of an appeal to SHAB, how does that lend itself to good land use decisions? Peter?
So I guess the way I would weigh in on it is, I think there are good points raised in both of your comments. I think, I'll start with your comments, Maria. I think you should look at it from a perspective of what's the right decision here. But I also think you should look at it as what based on the development that you are willing to approve. So if you're only going to approve a 37 unit, you should consider whether or not that is the right decision instead of comparing it to what the applicant came in and what they asked for. Now, I can tell you either way, whether you approve it with conditions, and, well, I'm speculating, but I think it's a good speculation. Regardless of what you do, it could be appealed to SHAB. And, you know, I could give you my best guess of what SHAB would do in each circumstance, whether you ask for it or not. But I think really the question for the board to consider is, what do you think the right thing to do is from the planning's perspective, considering the factors that you're required to consider? What's the right call? At SHAB, SHAB will do what it's going to do. And, if you wanted my opinion on how that would affect versus what you do, I could give it to you, but, ultimately, it's your call of what you think the right thing to do is.
So I'd like to ask members kind of what their sense is at this point, and then I think we should go through these findings, because the findings could be deemed to come to more than one conclusion. Who wants to start?
Can I ask a couple of quick questions before we do this?
Yes.
Sorry. So I don't find in this document where it really talks about the fact that the hotel and the restaurant are owned by a separate party. And is that not a pretty significant item in our conclusions today, that this is an entirely separate party that owns a piece of this property?
So my understanding, and I'll let staff correct me if I'm misstating, is that the current applicant before you includes the owner of the west restaurant parcel that's being replaced and the owner of the hotel. The parcel that hasn't been included is the east restaurant parcel, and that was the restaurant that the applicant ultimately was saying they didn't want to give up. So that's why the conditions in the draft that's before you, they don't say, here's what you must do on the east restaurant parcel. Instead, they say, here's what that's why they're focused on reducing the unit count of the apartment unit to be consistent with the overall parking. Now, if they came back and they could ask to change that by saying, well, now we want to get rid of the restaurant use, whether they do or they don't. But that's why I believe staff can focus the conditions on the unit count and the parcels that were put into the application.
But then I guess why weren't those 50 parking spots parsed right out of the conversation? Because as if there was already a restaurant sitting on that site, that belongs to somebody else. And maybe they're just parking 50 cars on that restaurant pad, but those parking spots shouldn't even be part of our conversation because it's essentially a built restaurant with 50 parking spots.
It's my understanding, staff, that's basically what they did. They said 50, you need 50 for the restaurant because you have final approval for the restaurant, you need 117 for the hotel, and then basically what you have left over can support the unit count of 37 units.
So,
Susan?
for clarity, the table on page 8,
I know. Doesn't matter. No, it doesn't matter.
so if everybody can look at the table on page 8, you have the column associated with parcel data originally approved. application required parking through the town's regulations and proposed parking. And this is where we try to address it. We had the Restaurant East, and we're recommending we add the language under separate ownership to that left column. Originally approved with 50, required town regulations 50, proposed parking 0. Applicant has stated that restaurant is not part of the application, yet the parking for the restaurant has not been accounted for in the proposal to site a new apartment building within the district. We're also recommending adding the following language. In fact, it was removed from the counts for District 5. You could use the term they stole it to account for parking at the hotel in their new apartment complex, pretending that the restaurant didn't exist, yet explaining during their testimony that they didn't want to relinquish any vested rights to actually build the restaurant. And in Eric DePreet's report, it says, we'll deal with that later. So
this
we are making that recommendation. So again, in Restaurant West, it's being eliminated. The hotel requires 100, it had 103, it requires 117, they're parking at 135. The new apartment never existed, requires 140, they were parking at 106. They were proposing to supply 241 parking spaces. When again, we back out the restaurant, back out the requirements for the hotel, there are X number of spaces, and at 2 spaces per that number, it equates to 37 residential units, fully parked
Find
under
your
our
table
regulations.
to me to be confusing because it says proposed parking for the restaurant is 0. It can't be 0, it's already been approved.
Their proposed parking under their application does not park the restaurant.
It shouldn't even mention the restaurant because they don't have access to that parking. That parking does not exist
They-
in the math.
They're using it in their calculation.
Yeah, I think that, just.
But I think we need to take, I'm sorry, I think we need to take it out because you've got it appearing that they can put 0 in that category and use the number, that's what it appears.
What we're saying is they did. We're not saying they can. We're actually, in fact, saying they can't. And they need to fully park that restaurant at 50.
Because they're only adding 72 spaces, and I guess we've been swimming in this since October. I want someone who runs through this in an hour I want it to be clear to someone else reviewing this, who doesn't have the history, the shell game that's going on with the parking. That's all I'm concerned, if everyone else understands it, that's great. But I want someone who's reading this quickly to know right off the bat that there's some funny parking stuff going on in this table.
They are proposing, in their application, they showed 241 parking spaces for a hotel and an apartment complex. They did not account for an approved restaurant on the site. The regulations to fully park a restaurant, a hotel, and an apartment complex will require 307 parking spaces. They only proposed to park 241. It is their error, not ours. The regulations require that that restaurant be fully parked. They tried to exclude it from the application. As a vested right on a separate property owner, I don't see how a planning board in an approval process can take away that right from someone who's not even involved in this application. So our recommendation to you was to recognize that it still exists as an approved restaurant, fully park it, fully park the hotel, and then what's left, they can park an apartment complex on the site. So it's clear, too, that from a hotel perspective, when it was originally approved, there was overflow parking. There's no ability to have any excess parking. There's no on-street parking. We can park on a driveway. We can park on a traveled way. They don't own their access road to their site. They don't own additional land at the restaurant where they could say they could put parking unless the restaurant becomes part of the application. Their legal counsel made it clear, not part of the application, not relinquishing any vested rights to the restaurant. So from a regulatory standpoint, park it then. Park that, park the hotel. I'm not aware under a comprehensive permit process that you can seek relief for 2 commercial ventures. So our take is there was no request to reduce the parking for the hotel, but in their application, the hotel's fully parked at 135 spaces.
Thanks, Jamie. I think we've got it.
Okay, everybody,
pretty clear. I would, going back to my earlier comment, I would like to get a sense of board members in which direction they would like to proceed so that we can go through these findings that Jamie has outlined. And again, to reiterate what has been expressed earlier, in approving a comprehensive permit application, the board shall make positive findings supported by legally competent evidence on the record which discloses the nature and character of the observations upon which the fact finders acted on each of the following standard provisions. So for approval, the proposed development is consistent with local needs as identified in the local comprehensive community plan, with particular emphasis on the community's affordable housing plan, and/or has satisfactorily addressed the issues where there may be inconsistencies. B, the proposed development is in compliance with the standards and provisions of the municipality zoning ordinance and subdivision regulations, and/or where expressly varied or waived local concerns that have been affected by the relief granted do not outweigh the state and local need for low and moderate income housing. C, all low and moderate income housing units proposed or integrated throughout the development are compatible in scale and architectural style to the market rate units within the project and will be built and occupied prior to or simultaneous with the construction and occupancy of any market rate units. D, there will be no significant negative environmental impacts from the proposed development as shown on the final plan with all required conditions for approval. E, there will be no significant negative impacts on the health and safety of current or future residents of the community in areas including but not limited to safe circulation or pedestrian and vehicular traffic, provision of emergency services, sewerage disposal, availability of potable water, adequate surface water runoff, and the preservation of natural, historical, or cultural features that contribute to the attractiveness of the community. F, all proposed land developments and all subdivision lots will have adequate and permanent physical access to a public street in accordance with the requirements of Rhode Island General Law 452365. And G, the proposed development will not result in the creation of individual lots with any physical constraints to development that building on those lots according to pertinent regulations and building standards would be impracticable unless created only as permanent open space or permanently reserved for a public purpose on the approved recorded plans. So those are requirements that need to be, the findings need to be addressed for each of those provisions. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, let's just, I want to get a sense of where people are at.
So, I'm in favor of denial for this project. I believe that it's inconsistent with the town planning documents, that being the master plan. I believe it's inconsistent with a long history of planning efforts for that specific area. I find that it is inconsistent with the expectations of the neighbors, neighboring property owners. Many of them invested their life savings in this in the neighboring property. I find that the applicant had no reasonable expectations that he would be able to build residential, and he actually had specific notice that he would not be able to allow to build residential. I find that the connectivity to the town amenities, the circulation within the site, the lighting, the parking, landscaping, potential noise, requirements for recreational space, all have been previously designed based on no residential, and that allowing this now would be inconsistent with all those previous planning documents. I find that changing this now would cause irreparable harm to the neighboring property owners for their privacy and would be against all the notices and expectations they had when they purchased their property. I find that it's inconsistent with the town's comprehensive plan, or if not specifically the comprehensive plan, that the master plan specifically stand in for the comprehensive plan, which, when we make our deliberations, because it represents all the same of long-term planning efforts for that, specifically for that area, as well as notices to both applicants and neighboring property owners.
Thanks, Joe. Liz?
Since I can't touch what Joe just said, because you covered every little bit, I'm just going to zoom in on a smaller piece. This business about the 37 units. We were here at a meeting not very long ago, it might have even been last week, where we talked about the delineation of the buildings, and isn't it possible to break down the buildings into the building into smaller pieces? It would be more appropriate. And I believe it, I don't know if it was their planner, but somebody said, no, it is not feasible to do that because we would have to reduce the number of units which would be economically infeasible for us to proceed with the project. So I guess I don't understand how we are making the major, what appears to me to be the major condition on this project based on the parking, that they have to cut down the number of units to 37. It just seems like, I don't want to say we're playing games, but we're playing a negotiation that
Madam Chair,
just is not appropriate,
sorry.
because we know they can't do it.
If I could address that point, just to make the board aware of one issue that may come up, is that if you were to deny the application and it's appealed to SHAB, and it's overturned at SHAB, and your denial is reversed, just the board should be aware that that reversal would be without the opportunity to impose those types of conditions. So it would be at the full 70-unit count.
I think we understand that, and they can also completely ignore our conditions that we may have put in to an approval.
That they could appeal them. It would be a different standard. And if SHAB overturned if SHAB overturned the approval with conditions, then whatever conditions SHAB thought were unlawful would be removed. So I guess I was just putting out there why staff would draft a motion in that way, because if you wanted to negotiate a lesser unit count, or it's not a negotiation, it's condition. If you
We
wanted,
haven't had the ability to negotiate
Right.
in this particular project from day one.
if you think it would be appropriate to have a lesser unit count, this is the opportunity.
I see.
Thanks.
But I don't think we can be afraid of our decision being overturned. Otherwise, we shouldn't be sitting here.
Robin?
Well, I don't think that the concerns for the environment, health, and safety of the current residents has been adequately addressed. I think we've said that in numerous ways. We have no idea how that road's even going to work, or how it's going to change their ability to enjoy their property. I don't think that it's a project that's in conformance with the comprehensive plan, because it's doing exactly what we didn't want to do with District 5. And our long-term plan was to have a place where people could find employment in light industry and office space, commercial. And I think that, again, being in conformance with the comp plan means that we stick to our plan and we don't just wildly amend it. And I think that if they wanted to negotiate after we deny it, they could always come back with a new plan.
Thanks. Paul? Okay. Susan? Just looking for direction here, and we're gonna take a break after this, and then we'll go through the findings.
I'm leaning in favor of approval. I think that 37 units goes a long way. I realize they're not all affordable. It's still 37 new rental units. I think there is a huge need in town. I know people who are moving to Hopkinton, Richmond, Points West, because they've lost their apartments, they can't stay. I think that there is a huge need. I think particularly looking at something half the size negates a lot of the concerns. And again, I don't want to get hung up on who said what about the process. Is there an impact on the neighbors? Yes, every development that we look at has an impact on the neighborhood. There are not a lot of places in town, as people have pointed out, whether it's 1% or 4%, there's not a lot of towns zoned for multifamily housing. There are not a lot of opportunities to do this kind of development. If it has to go somewhere, and it really does, this is not the worst location.
Thanks. Susan?
I agree, Paul, that we need more rental units in this town. I'm concerned that they won't be year-round rental units for families, and that's a real big concern for me, that's really just a wash for us. That doesn't help us affordable good, the rest of it is just, it's a money-making scheme that's not going to help our town. So I'm worried about that part. What I am worried about with a SHAB appeal is, and maybe, Peter, you can help me, they can't park all of these cars because of that, the neighbor's restaurant. How does SHAB do the math on parking spaces if 50 of the spaces actually belong to the neighbor? Like, what does that look like in front of SHAB? The numbers.
So it would depend, based on the nature of the appeal, whether it was appeal from a denial or an appeal from a conditional approval. Which would you like me to address, or would you like me to address both?
Is there a difference in how they do math on parking spots? That's important. That would be important to me, because I don't want to roll the dice too hard on this.
So, from my experience with SHAB, I don't think they're going to be too concise. I don't think they're going to be concise about the math. It's not going to be specifics about the math. Ultimately, they will say that there is a waiver at some point, whether they correctly stated the waiver amount or not, that would allow them to have an apartment complex either at 37 or 70 units. The SHAB is going to say, granting this waiver for X amount of parking spaces on these two lots. And I think they'd have to discount the lot that's not involved. They just look at, does that waiver outweigh, does granting that waiver support the state and local need for affordable housing? Or, let me rephrase that. Does state and local need for affordable housing outweigh the town's need to enforce that condition, or not?
So if they built a 70-unit apartment building, the hotel is having a busy July night, and the restaurant is hopping, how does the math work on the parking for all the people coming home to their apartments? Like, what's that future scenario? Who's responsible? How do we resolve? There's no on-street parking. You can't tell the tenants at the apartments they can't have a car because, they're going to have a car. Like, what happens when you need 375 parking spaces and you only have 126? Like, what's the fallout from that for the town and for the residents and for the people at the hotel and all the neighbors? And what becomes of SHAB saying, sure, 70 units, go for it?
Unfortunately, the way the state law is set is that those type of local decisions can be made at the state level. So whatever the impacts are, they will be. But if SHAB says 70 units, go for it, they'll go for 70 units.
So would they then, I'm not beating on this too much, but then the hotel residents don't have any parking. They've rented a room, they roll into town, there's no place to put a car. This project then impacts a different commercial entity who can't function because there's no parking at the hotel,
So
or vice versa.
I'd say the arguments at SHAB, our argument at SHAB, if you were to have denial, would be that there would be insufficient parking for the residential unit, given the nature of the area, the fact that cars are going to be needed. I'll tell you about what SHAB will care about the commercial uses is they won't care at all. They don't grant waivers for commercial uses. They don't care if there's sufficient parking for commercial uses. Commercial uses are separate.
I think we should take a 5-minute break. If you want to further. Yeah, I want to think on this. Okay. All right, 5-minute break. The board is back from their 5-minute break. We have a draft motion before us, along with several pages of findings that we need to go through. Based on our earlier conversation, it appears that we have 4 members who believe that this is grounds for denial, and 1 who believe approval, and Susan not yet decided, but nevertheless, we should go through these findings. So at the beginning of the motion, there is reference made to, which I believe is completely relevant, previous approvals for the master plan going back to 1998 in the initial document. And please feel free to add any additions or corrections or comments. Then we get to findings of fact. The planning board finds that understanding the approval process associated with the village at South County Commons is essential to understanding the general premise for which the village South County Commons was created and the development approval process that occurred within Village of South County Commons. Yes, no, comments? A lot of this is just referencing the,
I think that understanding the approval process goes against this project.
so you're saying this should be in the denial?
Yeah.
Referencing, yes. The next finding is, again, a reference that it's located within the town's Route 1 SMD, how it's regulated, how the planning board reviewed the history, and then it has dates associated with that. Everybody good with that? The next, item number 3 makes a reference to, in the creation of the SMD, that it would encourage the creation of jobs within the community, expand the municipal tax base, create opportunities for expansion of non-residential uses, particularly commercial and industrial uses, and that the development of business uses in the zone are feasible and practical. And I'm just wondering if this would be the point at which we might also make reference to the fact that, according to our comprehensive plan, the land available for commercial development in South Kingstown, I believe, is less than 1%.
I
Yes?
don't know if it has to be in that findings of fact, maybe immediately following.
Okay.
And I think the other thing is that this land area is ideally suited for attracting
Joe, we're not going to pick you up.
I think that in addition to the fact that the town only has less than 1% commercial, that this land, due to its proximity and its visibility to Route 1, is ideally suited for attracting businesses from both residents of the town as well as out-of-town residences that may be passing by. So it's ideally suited for restaurants, hotels, and those type of applications.
So is that a separate paragraph from 3?
Yeah, I
So
think
that
it
would be the new
3,
4.
4, and 5.
Okay.
And we can move
Yep.
about 4 down to maybe 6.
Okay. Then the next paragraph references the preliminary submission, design manual, narrative, and supporting materials. Design, basically the same thing. Light industry, institutional, office, and commercial development was the primary economic development surrounding the village center. The design manual also notes that the housing component that was originally envisioned and ultimately constructed was designed to round off a balanced community by including an assisted living / healthcare facility, low-impact residential housing, and 35 acres of future low-impact residential development bounded by the reserve of open space and parks. Yes? Not necessary?
I think that's important.
Everyone agree with that?
Madam Chair, we will not pick up Robin's comment without the mic on and the echo.
Yeah, the mic is on. Yep. I don't quite exactly see how
Okay, so we'll
item 5
kind of put
connects.
parentheses around that for now. In the original approval, the developer stated that pedestrian circulation through the village is a strong component of the developer's design and that a lot of emphasis has gone into creating a pedestrian-friendly street system with pedestrian parks located throughout the site. In fact, the regulatory requirements for the SMD, and then below it has the pedestrian and bicycle circulation requirements. Then below that, it states that until this application, this requirement has never come into question as it relates to other proposals associated with District 5, because the original approval prohibited residential development from being developed in District 5, and any amendment to District 5 did not include a residential component. Based on the history of the permitting for District 5, it is our conclusion as a planning board that the original development scenario proposed by the developer included this prohibition on residential development simply because it was not possible to comply with the requirements of Section 605.22 of the Village of South County Commons application. I mean, I don't know that we can speak to why this was not, this direction, they didn't move in this direction because it was impossible to comply. I mean, my recollection is that there were certain percentages that the town council decided that should be allowed in the special management district. They had a certain percentage of commercial, light industrial, and so on. So I'm not sure if the second part of the sentence is, you know, I think we're making a supposition on the part of the original development scenario.
Actually, Madam Chair, just for clarification, are you in the second paragraph until this application?
Yes.
The comment based on the history of permitting for District 5, it is our conclusion as a planning board that the original development scenario proposed by the developer included this prohibition on residential development simply because it was not possible to comply with the requirements of Section 605.22, which was old Section 33.8. That is a regulatory requirement contained in the original SMD and carried through in a renumbering or codification of that. So in the original application, there was a requirement that any residential development was connected to the village. You couldn't have approved District 5 with that original condition. So I don't
Stay in there.
think it's a jump to make that conclusion. It's actually a regulatory conclusion. District 5 with the residential component does not comply with Section 605.22, nor did it comply with the old Section 338V. And it's actually contained in their submission material.
Okay, and the next one is a bullet. It should be noted that the applicant has,
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, you're reading, it should know the applicant has not requested a waiver. So just want to make sure I understand, because this is a comp permit, even though they haven't requested a waiver, we can waive that requirement? I have to ask, okay.
I have to ask.
yes. So, without an approved waiver of this provision or change to the original master plan approval, the applicant is not in compliance with the town zoning requirement.
Can they do that at preliminary, or you don't know? I mean, again, I'm just looking at what professional staff has given us all of this information and then said, but by the way, none of it really fits a comp permit denial. I just find it very
I
confusing.
don't think they're saying that at all. I think all of these findings support a denial.
Well, that's not what they say in the draft memo, in the draft motion.
Well, we haven't gotten to that part yet.
I can just try to clarify.
Still in findings.
In all the findings, we're pointing out potential deficiencies
Exactly.
with regards to elements of the zoning regulations in your comprehensive community plan. In the suggested conditions, those conditions, in essence, attempt to make the findings which are negative more compliant. And without those conditions, you can potentially conclude that you don't meet, the comprehensive plan requirements, the zoning compliance issues.
So without searching through the 13 pages here, I can assume, I think that somewhere in the conditions, this particular issue is addressed. The applicant must request a waiver at some point. Is that what we're doing here? Yeah.
So
Sorry.
I think to that issue, the statute is clear that any waiver they want needs to be specified. So in that respect, I guess you could say staff was being charitable, looking at it charitably, but that finding is correct. By statute, to request a waiver, you should identify the waivers you need.
Okay, the SMD was created in 1998 through an extensive public-private effort between the town of South Kingstown, the developers project team, town residents, and other related owners. So again, that's just another historical reference. The proposed 70-unit apartment building is located on District 5, which is just one component or district of a larger 152-acre, 8-district planned development project with a mix of residential and commercial uses known as Village at South County Commons. The entire Village at South County Commons development was originally granted conceptual master plan approval on August 11, 1998. The conceptual master plan approved for Village South County Commons includes 8 numbered districts. The subject project, proposed 70-unit apartment building, is located in District 5, which is the final district to be developed in the Village of South County Commons. As originally planned, District 5 contained a total of 19.98 acres that included 14.78 acres of usable land. Everyone okay with that? The conceptual master plan issued by the Planning Board on August 11, 1998 was based in part on a master plan, land use plan prepared by the applicant that specified that the anticipated uses within District 5 included 100% light industry, commercial, and office uses, and that use limitations in District 5 prohibited retail or residential uses. It should be noted that the applicant has not requested a waiver of this requirement. The original master plan approval for the development set a standard for no less than 50% commercial, and that the original approval specifically identified that no less than 52.8% of the development would be light industrial, commercial, or institutional, roughly 1/3 of which, 17.7%, was to be located in District 5. As shown on the master plan, open space plan associated with the original master plan approval, as well as on the wetland exhibit provided by the applicant, the developable land within District 5 has always been physically isolated from the other Village at South County Common districts by a large intervening area of forested freshwater wetlands located along the southern end of District 4, along the northern end of District 5, and throughout the open space district of District 7, which separates Districts 4 and 5. In 2002, a landowner involved in the development of Village of South County Commons conveyed the northern portion of District 5, AP 50-4, Lot 23, to the Emma Pendleton Bradley Hospital, thereby legally separating the balance of the District 5 property from the remainder of Village of South County Commons. This conveyance legally, fee simple ownership, separated the remaining portions of District 5 from the northern Village of South County Commons development. Yes? Good with that? On October 12, 2017, the Planning Board granted preliminary plan approval for the remaining land in District 5 for 49,900 square foot hotel, a 3,600 square foot pool building, and 2 additional building footprints with uses to be determined at a later date. In accordance with the land use restrictions contained in the 1998 conceptual master plan, the preliminary plan approval was subject to conditions that all, quote, subsequent phases shall be strictly limited to office, bank, non-retail, or restaurant uses, associated accessory uses, parking, and site improvements. Everybody okay with that? On November 13, 2017, the planning board granted a final plan approval for the hotel on District 5, subject to a condition that site development shall be in strict conformance with the above-referenced approved plans and the enclosed preliminary plan approval issued October 12, 2017. On November 30, 2017, a site layout plan for District 5 was recorded showing a hotel and associated pool buildings and 2 other commercial building footprints. The site layout plan identifies, quote, condition of town approval, end quote, which specify that, quote, subsequent phases shall be strictly limited to office, bank, non-retail, or restaurant uses, associated accessory uses, parking, and site improvements. Yes.
I'm wondering on each of these, I'm wondering on if each of these approvals, whether we should make reference to the fact that the planning board approved and its requirements was based to be consistent with the master plan, which specifically called out no residential. I think it is important for us to show a long history of consistent land use deliberations and practices, and to show that our decision tonight is not based on a whim on our either our like or dislike of this project, but our attempt to be consistent with this long history of deliberations and our requirements.
That makes sense. You've got this, right, Jamie?
It's just, Madam Chair, I think the way we've laid that out in the creation of the district, the creation of the regulatory changes, the creation of the district, the amendments, is literally laying out that work, that this is a series of events by a landowner to continue to adhere to what was originally approved until this point.
My feeling is that that's not necessarily strong enough, that the initial decision for no residential is one thing. However, each and every time a project comes before this board, its deliberations, its requirements, its conditions of approval were all based specifically at that time by that board, by their thought process, that this was based on no residential. It's not a matter of at one point in time we said no residential and then some time elapsed and now we want to change. This is a long history of consistent decisions by this town specific to that area. And I think it's important to show that this has been consistent over and over again each time this has come in front of the board.
Yeah, I agree that that language should be added so that it's very clear that this has nothing to do with any kind of arbitrary like or dislike, as you mentioned, but consistency with previous decisions.
Each and every point.
At each and every point.
So is that a recommendation to make a concluding remark further down, that based on all of these findings?
Certainly, yeah, yes. On February 27th, 2018, the Planning Board approved an amendment to the preliminary plan approval for District 5, granted on October 12th, 2017, for site layout, grading, and utility changes, which includes a condition of approval specifying that unless amended by the conditions contained herein, all conditions of the preliminary plan approval granted October 12, 2017, and the final plan approval granted November 13, 2017, remain in full force and effect. On April 11, 2019, the Planning Board granted amended final plan approval for District 5, authorizing changes to building footprints and parking layouts for the proposed future use locations approved in 2017, subject to a condition of approval specifying that unless amended by the conditions contained herein, all conditions of the preliminary plan approval dated October 13, 2017, final plan approval dated November 13, 2017, and the amended preliminary plan approval dated March 1st, 2018, remain in full force in effect. On May 7th, 2019, an amended site layout plan for District 5 was recorded, showing the existing hotel and revised building uses, footprints, and parking layouts for the two undeveloped commercial buildings. The amended plan recites conditions of town approval previously imposed on District 5 by all prior approvals, stating that subsequent phases shall be strictly limited to office, bank, non-retail, or restaurant uses, associated accessory uses, parking, and site improvements. In accordance with those conditions, the amended plan specifies that both commercial footprints will be used exclusively as restaurant. I think that's a really important statement. As of September 2019, District 5 had final plan approval and a final recorded site plan for a purely commercial development, which included a 105-room hotel and 2 restaurant pads sharing integrated parking, drainage, and other infrastructure amenities, which had been substantially developed through the construction of the hotel and its associated pool building. Is there any need for clarification on this paragraph? Jamie?
Again, it's a chronology of the approval process associated with District 5.
On or about August 4th, 2022, an application for pre-application concept review for the subject residential apartment project within District 5 was filed on behalf of the applicant proposing the construction of a 70-unit residential apartment building. The application materials, including a July 20, 2022 letter summarizing the context of the proposed development submitted for pre-application concept review, did not provide a single reference to the previously approved conceptual master plan, did not reference any of the existing land use limitations contained in the previous approvals relating to District 5, nor did the applicant indicate that there was any interest to amend those land use limitations prior to proceeding with the proposed residential development project.
Just clarity, in that last sentence, you use any interest. I believe the word is intent.
Yes, any intent, and any is underlined in this particular paragraph. On or about September 30, 2022, a conceptual master plan application for a multi-household land development, major land development project was filed with the planning department proposing the development of a 70-unit residential apartment building in District 5. The application materials, including a September 29, 2022 letter summarizing the context of the proposed development submitted for conceptual master plan review, did not provide a single reference to the previously approved conceptual master plan, did not reference any of the existing land use limitations contained in the previous approvals relating to District 5, nor did the applicant indicate that there was any intent to amend or remove those land use limitations as a prerequisite to proceeding with the proposed residential development project. The application submitted on September 30, 2022 was submitted as a conceptual master plan application for a major multi-household land development project for District 5 rather than as an application to amend the previously approved conceptual master plan for District 5. The application for a multi-household land development, major land development project was determined to be complete on December 14, 2022. After the application was determined to be complete, planning staff identified that the application materials lacked any reference to allowed development densities within District 5, which could be confirmed by the submission of a yield plan or from any prior conceptual master plan approvals for a village at South County Commons. Accordingly, planning staff reached out to the applicant's engineering consultant for additional information. In response to several emails from planning staff regarding density and yield of the property, the project engineer, Eric Privy, PE, with Dupree Engineering, Inc., provided the following conflicting responses to staff. We have never done a yield plan for a commercial multifamily use. We have the plan which shows the previously approved restaurant within the submitted master plan site plans. If you give me the use you want to show, we can figure something out. If you want a residential use, maybe suggest the style of residential, the density that you want for it, and if it should be based on the entire 150-acre parcel of the Route 1 SMD as the ordinance calls for and was done in the past. We have a supporting exhibit attached that demonstrates the appropriateness of the density to the previously approved residential projects within South County Commons. Ed Pimentel will also be at the upcoming meeting to provide expert testimony regarding the appropriateness of the density for this project. Email from Eric Privy, project engineer, Dupree Engineering, February 22nd, 2023. Yes, is this relevant? Jamie?
Just asking legal a question, so if you can just back up for a moment. So can you restate the question?
28A, with regard to an email from the project engineer as far as the yield plan and the quote that maybe suggests the style of residential and the density that you want for it, and if it should be located on the entire 150 parcel and so on. And as you know, we were never given the opportunity to really have that dialogue relative to what we thought would be either appropriate style or density.
Madam Chair, just to put some perspective on this, that paragraph A, as well as the B and the C following that, I think the intent of that was just to portray to the board that the confusing testimony that we got in regard to the density is what triggered us to go back and kind of start looking at stuff. And that there was never, in my opinion, we never really had a good feeling as to what we were actually talking about. As you can tell, if you look at these different A, B, and C, they're entirely different concepts, contexts that were thrown to try to answer the question, which then, as I said, left us
Again,
scrambling to figure out what the answer really is.
we're trying to clarify in the application that there was no density calculation for residential included in the initial application. It's only after our evaluation and conclusion that there was a restriction on the property by prior approvals that we started to get into a more in-depth conversation with the applicant's representatives about how you feel you were vested in density when, in fact, the original approval didn't allow residential development. I think it's relevant to the discussion and the chronology of the application process.
Can I ask, what was the context? That, for example, this first email says, if you give me the use you want to show, we can figure something out if you want a residential use. Had we said something to them and then they're like, I don't know, you want a house? I'll build you a house. Like, I don't understand why they would write that to you or us. If you want a residential use, like, implying that we're asking for residential?
Well, it would be helpful, obviously, you've seen that we have a majority of the board that wants a denial, so we're relying on your assistance to make sure that that denial is sufficient and comprehensive as possible, given the fact that there will be likely an appeal.
I think the answer to your question is best answered by Eric Prevey, who's not here. The email that I sent and the information I was requesting was relatively simple. His explanation I did not understand the answer that was provided to me.
Yeah. And I think it just goes to the context of the question was, what's your yield information? And it wasn't provided with the application, and when we followed up, we received inconsistent answers.
Yep, so it demonstrates unanswered questions and inconsistency. Per the Route 1 Special Management District ordinance, the usable area is measured across all parcels that are part of development. Under the currently approved master plan that we are vested, we have 84.05 acres of usable land. In just District 5, we have 14.76 acres usable land per the original master plan. On just the future lot that we are creating for the multifamily building, we have 4.5 acres of usable land. 5 acres per unit of usable land is a change that was made to the Route 1 SMD zoning after approval of the District 5 master plan, and we do not know how it would be reconciled with the entire South County Commons that this development is part of for zoning conformance or the District 5 area. We show the density of the other South County Commons multifamily by the lot area for purposes of comparison. An email from Eric Privy, project engineer, Dupree Engineering, February 24th, 2023. More confusing language, it seems to me, confusing statement. Whether that's necessary to reinforce our findings, again, if
I think A, B, and C, Madam Chair, again, is the email responses from Eric Prevey from Pre-Engineering, trying to solidify why they feel they have residential density vested on a property that has never allowed residential development.
Next one is I put some more thought into your question over the weekend. You brought up the density of 5 units per developable acre. I would like to call to your attention the attached Route 1 SMD zoning ordinance from May 10, 1999. As you know, we have a vested and active master plan from that period. That zoning permitted 15 and 17 units per developable acre, which is what we are generally at now. I hope this helps the planning board reconcile the significant history of this parcel, that there are property rights in place because of a previous planning board approval, and that this is not the case of a new standalone project or lot coming by itself today. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. I think that should be eliminated. Everybody okay with that?
We're
Eliminating C?
What are you trying to show, inconsistency?
Yes, that
Property rights in place.
he's talking about that,
That's right.
Under C, he's attempting to articulate that they have vested density, and in the 2 bullets below C, we make statements that there's no vested density,
okay.
nor the applicant,
Right, so that
nor have they asked
should
for a
stay,
waiver.
because you then refute that. In regard to this comment regarding density, it should be noted that the applicant referenced the 5 dwelling units per developable acre as the applicable density. The following was outlined in the applicant's requested list of waivers for the project. I, maximum allowable residential density, 5 dwelling units per developable acre. Waiver requested to allow 17 dwelling units per developable acre. It should be noted that the residential prohibition placed on District 5 by the original applicant as part of the 1998 master plan approval has remained in place during any revisions to the SMD ordinance language. So obviously that last bullet is important. On or about March 1st, 2023, South Kingstown Planning Department staff reviewed the permitting history of the project to verify the above referenced claims by the applicant's engineer regarding the vesting of residential units within District 5. In doing so, staff became aware of the fact that the August 11th, 1998 conceptual master plan for the Village of South County Commons specifically approved and vested District 5 for the following. District 5, use limitations, no retail or residential. Anticipated use, 100% light industry, commercial, office, institutional. Use, light industrial office, total usable area, 14.78 acres. Percentage of usable site area, 17.5%. In a March 20, 2023 letter from the Planning Department to the applicant, the Planning Department outlined the above findings in regard to the density and vesting information related to the waiver request for this application. Staff advised the applicant that in order to proceed with the current proposal, the applicant would need to amend their August 11, 1998 conceptual master plan approval with the planning board to authorize and vest any residential development within District 5. In a May 9, 2023 letter to the Planning Department, the applicant's legal counsel agreed to a third extension of the application up to and including June 1st, 2023, and also stated, to the extent necessary, please also accept this as a request to include a proposed amendment to the 1998 South County Commons Master Plan as part of the application. It should be noted that the pending application contains no information, background material, or reference included in the application that considers amending the master plan for District 5 or the Village of South County Commons, nor is there any backup information to address the balance of uses that were previously vested, approved, and proposed to be eliminated by the applicant without further consideration. The May 9th, 2023 letter represents the first instance wherein the applicant recognized an obligation to amend the 1998 conceptual master plan requirements for District 5 in order to allow residential development in that district. Attorney Matthew J. Landry Esquire, project attorney for the applicant, mentioned in his testimony several times during the public informational meeting that parcel AP 50-4, lot 25 is not part of the subject application, and that the rights to develop AP 50-4, lot 25 as previously approved restaurant pad referenced to as Restaurant East are not being abandoned by the owners of that lot as part of the application process for the proposed 70-unit apartment building. The following table 1.1 depicts the number of spaces required by the town's regulations for the uses in District 5 and the proposed spaces that the applicant proposes to have in District 5. So there's a table 1.1, proposed multi-household land development on 2 parcels of land, AP 50-4, lots 22 and 26, within Village at South County Commons, District 5. Any comments on this?
I just wonder if this is creating maybe more confusion with this much information, or should we just state that we find that the parking proposed is against the town ordinance, and we don't support the waiver such that there's, because there is no on-site, no on-street parking, there is no overflow parking, and that there is no existence of a shared agreement or currently transportation. So just basically say that they are, we find the parking's insufficient and that we don't support their waiver versus necessarily all these tables.
Yeah.
I think the tables are important. I think the level of detail is important.
So could we keep the table and then add Joe's thoughts to one of these bullets below? So the first bullet, it's important to note that the original 37 overflow parking spaces allocated to development as approved in 2018 and recorded in the town's land records, which had the hotel underparked regulatory compliance by 14 spaces, was completely reallocated to the new proposed 70-unit apartment complex, and the original parking allocated to restaurant is not accounted for. And perhaps that's when you might want to add your sentence or two.
I think that
Unless we
a
wanna
summary
add that
would be,
later on, because the board has to then find that the proposed parking versus the ordinance doesn't support waiver. So where should that go? So we have 3 bullets below that reference.
Madam Chair, maybe more appropriate under, it's either bullet 33 or 34, where there's a discussion on the existing development plan approval for the hotel authorizing a waiver reducing the required parking from 117. Actually, that's not, shouldn't be there.
So the first paragraph on 33 mentions the fact that the
Yeah.
references the table and demonstrates that the applicant is deficient 66 parking spaces as it relates to the zoning requirements associated with the parking required for all 3 uses within District 5.
I would just potentially add that as an additional bullet underneath the table,
Okay.
that there is no access to additional parking adjacent or within the site.
You good with that? And 33 and 34, although I think the numbers are no higher because we added text early on, reference the deficiency in the parking. The existing development plan approval for the hotel authorized a waiver reducing the required parking for the hotel from 117 spaces to 103 spaces. This waiver was granted based in part on the fact that the plan included 37 shared overflow parking spaces in between the hotel and the proposed restaurant location to the west, which, as we know, is now the location of the proposed multifamily development. Under the applicant's proposal, all 37 shared overflow parking spaces are to be dedicated exclusively to the parking needs of the new residential apartment use. Does that make sense? Is that something that should stay in?
Is it clear all 37 shared spaces are to be dedicated? Is it- Never mind.
And then additional regulatory findings, I feel that these 1 and 2, these are this is one of the most important areas in our findings. 1, the proposed project is non-compliant with the approved 1998 conceptual master plan for the Village at South County Commons as it proposes the construction of a residential use, a 70-unit apartment building within District 5. This proposed residential use within District 5 was not considered or proposed during the conceptual master plan process for the Village of South County Commons, and therefore is not vested in those residential allowances being pursued. It seems to me that there was a decision made by the town council at the time that allowed certain percentages of uses within the district as a whole. And that was a result of how the applicant at the time decided to manage their uses. So I'm not sure how this language should be modified, or if it needs to be modified. Because it's not that they said, we're thinking of having residential, it wasn't even a, I don't think it was even a consideration. I mean, there's quite a bit of residential throughout the entire village at South County Commons.
What if it was just changed to the word approved? The proposed residential use was not approved during the conceptual master plan process.
You know, I would actually restate it to highlight the applicant's role in the condition, since maybe the proposed residential or the applicant agreed that there would be no proposed residential use within District 5, or
Yeah, that's better. Yep.
because I'm thinking, you know, if there's going to be a denial, it could be looked at almost like a waiver by the applicant rather than the imposition of a condition by
Yep.
the town.
The conceptual master plan application associated with this major multi-household land development project, this should probably be, this is probably meant to be as submitted on September 30, 2022, does not meet the submission requirements of Rhode Island General Law 45-53-41 II, as the application does not identify or seek relief from specific land use restrictions that had been in place on the property for over 2 decades as part of multiple previously approved land development plans. As such, the applicant's failure to identify and seek relief from these restrictions as required by law effectively concealed them from town staff until after a certificate of completeness had been issued. These unidentified land use restrictions include, A, the limitation prohibiting retail or residential uses in District 5 as found in the 1998 Conceptual Master Plan for Village at South County Commons, and all subsequent land development approvals and record plans for District 5. The district under 605-22 of the SMD ordinance requires bicycle and pedestrian access and circulation to interconnect residential uses, non-residential uses, common open spaces, and with majority activity centers.
And
Maybe it
Madam,
should not have,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in for a potential third bullet point under that paragraph is the fact that the waiver for parking did not include the restaurant, the East Restaurant. So even though the application stated a waiver, they didn't state what they actually needed for a waiver because they didn't account for the 50 parking spaces on the East Restaurant.
So the waiver for parking did not include the Eastern Restaurant, did not, what was the rest of your sentence?
Just for clarity, under C, the applicant did not request a waiver for any parking associated with his previously approved restaurant, parentheses, east, required 50 parking spaces.
Okay. The major multi-household land development project application submitted on September 30, 2022 did not comply with the application requirements of the local regulations as it was submitted as a new application, underlined, rather than an application to amend a previously approved plan to alter existing land use restrictions placed on the property through 2 decades of land use applications and approvals. The applicant's failure to file the appropriate application and to seek relief from the existing land use restrictions effectively concealed them from town staff until after a certificate of completeness had been issued. This is kind of similar to what was in number 2. The planning board concludes that it cannot consider the proposed project as a new standalone major multi-household land development project for a portion of District 5 because A, District 5 is an integral component of and part of a larger development project, Village of South County Commons, that is almost fully built out in accordance with existing approvals, and B, the existing approved uses in District 5 were reviewed and approved as a single district containing an integrated set of uses that required amenities and infrastructure improvements to be shared. Accordingly, a major change to a previously approved use necessitates planning board review of the entire district to evaluate if and how that use functions and is balanced with the other approved uses within District 5 and the entirety of the Village at South County Commons. The development of District 5 has already commenced with approved and compliant uses based on existing approvals. These existing uses and their interactions, relationships with any associated new development should be reevaluated for compatibility and compliance when other uses are proposed. So, Jamie, was that meant to state that the first sentence is a really important one, that there are already approvals and uses that have relationships based on approvals and other uses? But then there's the second sentence talks about reevaluating for compatibility. Is that a reference to this specific plan? Or
Under C, it's the intent to recognize that the applicant submitted testimony that not all of the uses for District 5 should be discussed as part of this application, yet there's a recognition that they're interrelated with regards to easements and parking. So how can you exclude them? So it's either an amendment to the entire district, and and so the planning board can truly evaluate the mix of uses. And then you could take that further to the mix of uses within the entire 8 districts, because there were percentages originally identified, which were a few pages before.
Oh, so you're just, so your reevaluation is based on looking at the district as a whole if other uses are proposed.
At a minimum, District 5.
The planning board concludes that based on the permitting history of the site, the proposed project must be evaluated as an amendment to the previously approved conceptual master plan for Village of South County Commons and District 5 to allow the planning board to determine whether the proposed project, A, satisfies the existing development goals of the Village South County Commons and District 5, B, complies with existing development approvals for Village South County Commons and District 5, C, is compatible with existing development conditions in Village at South County Commons and District 5, and D, requires changes to previously approved but undeveloped portions of Village at South County Commons and District 5. 6, the applicant has not shown that the proposed project can be implemented without interfering with the conditions of approval for other commercial uses in District 5 because the application fails to fully address all of the development components currently approved for District 5. Another very important statement. The applicant's apartment proposal impermissibly alters existing parking approvals for commercial uses in District 5 because it reallocates parking that was previously available to the commercial uses in District 5 for exclusive use by the proposed apartment building. Again, that also clarifies the parking. By reallocating the shared parking previously approved for use by hotel guests and employees to the exclusive use of the residents of the apartment building, the applicants have created a core factor supporting the planning board's approval of a waiver for hotel parking authorizing a reduction in parking spaces from 117 to 103 spaces. As a result of the elimination of the shared parking, the planning board concludes that the hotel must now satisfy all town requirements for parking and provide 117 parking spaces that are available exclusively to hotel guests, staff, and visitors. Everybody okay with that? Jamie, you think that's consistent with everything we've been saying? The planning board makes the following findings regarding the supplemental parking analysis dated December 7, 2022, submitted in support of reduced parking requirements for the hotel, and finds that this testimony lacks credibility for the following reasons. A, the report is based in part upon information from an unidentified hotel manager, as no information is provided about the identity, background, or experience of the manager regarding the operation of this or any other hotel, and as the manager did not appear and offer testimony at hearing, the planning board cannot accept the opinions offered by the manager as credible evidence. The planning board further notes that there is no evidence that the manager possessed any information or knowledge for traffic and/or transportation planning, engineering, nor were they aware of the approved uses for the site that could be constructed and whether they factored those items into their conclusion. It is also the responsibility of the planning board to approve uses anticipating their success and not their potential underutilization of an approved facility devoid of present operations and/or brand affiliation. I'm not sure what that means. What does that brand affiliation mean?
Whether it's a Holiday Inn, a Hyatt, a Red Roof, Sheraton, Hilton, all those have different expectations and potentially different vacancy rates.
Planning board notes that this hotel has a very limited term of operation since 2019, much of which was impacted by a global pandemic during which normal travel vacation patterns were severely disrupted. As a result, any circumstantial observations made about parking conditions during that time likely do not represent normal or expected long-term parking patterns. B, the applicant's consultant testified that it was in their personal experience that apartment buildings need less parking than the regulations require, but provide no actual reference to their professional experience with this type of development, nor did they submit any studies to support these conclusions. So just wondering where, unless I'm not there yet, where the reference is to, for example, Joe's comment about his experience with parking and number of adults and so on.
Mr. Murphy's comments were incorporated into one of the conditions recommending that the waiver be denied for 1.5 and you hold at 2.0 per unit.
So with the denial, those won't necessarily be conditions, but rather supporting evidence?
Supporting evidence, and it's in the record.
The project does not meet local zoning requirements for parking pursuant to South Kingstown zoning ordinance because it does not allocate the 2 parking spaces required by the zoning ordinance for each residential unit. Parking is an issue of concern. The proposed project, as the project location is only accessible by automobile, has no access to public transit, has has no safe means of ingress, egress for pedestrians or cyclists, has no on-street parking, and excess parking would have to compete with adjacent commercial uses in District 5 that may be seasonally heavy and where peak parking demands will most likely overlap. Even at the substandard parking density proposed by the applicant, the project will reduce the availability of parking for existing and approved future uses in District 5. For example, the current proposal eliminates all of the parking for the approved restaurant in District 5. Building height pursuant to South Kingstown zoning ordinance 605-13, because the proposed building exceeds the height limit of 40 feet in the Route 1 SMD zone. The proposed height would make the building the tallest residential structure in South Kingstown and would be inconsistent with the village-scale development concept that is integral to the Village at South County Commons development approvals. Unit density to South Kingstown zoning ordinance 605-9D35, because the proposed 70-unit residential structure represents a density of 8.2 units per acre, where only 5 units per acre are allowed. Additionally, no residential use or unit density calculations have ever been considered, calculated, or vested for District 5 in prior approvals, since residential use was never intended or approved for this location. Now, this was changed, didn't you change this to 8 point something?
17.
Okay, 15.5 units per acre. So, now we would have conditions for denial, and, yes. Sure. Absolutely, yep.
So one of the additional findings I think is appropriate is that this site is physically isolated from the town of Wakefield, with the only connections being a 4-lane state highway and a private road. That residents in the neighboring area of the owner of the private road came out. Numerous of them gave testimony that they are currently already, their privacy is invaded by people cutting through that, and gave testimony that they believe that it would be exacerbated if residential development was allowed to go in this area.
Did you get all that, Jamie?
Why we're recording.
Exacerbated, even though they probably would be exasperated, but.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
If I can read that back, Madam Chair. Physically, oh, sorry. Just scroll down 5 pages. That the project is physically isolated from Wakefield proper, that Route 1 creates a barrier between the development and Wakefield, that there is no private additional access off of the private road with regards to walking, and that the privacy of the neighboring development has been exacerbated as part of this application.
Yes. Agreed.
It says access to historic Wakefield, but I think more so it's access to any other place. It doesn't, you can't get to South County Commons, you can't get to Peacedale. I don't want it to sound like we don't like that it doesn't get to Wakefield. It doesn't get to any other populated space.
Which may be similar but slightly different point that I was trying to make is the hardship that is being created to the neighboring property owners. So it was specific to the Wakefield area, since that was the neighboring property owners on between those two.
Okay.
I don't have a additional section here, but I do have a question about something we've been talking about, if it's okay to ask a question on this. Sure. There are a few places here where we've said that they didn't ask for a waiver and they should ask for a waiver. If we approve this at 37 units and they come back and ask for a waiver for one of these things, do we have the option to deny that waiver, thereby essentially denying the project? Like, are we, like, how does that work?
So if you were to approve it at 37 units, I'm assuming they would appeal to SHAB. If SHAB overturned that conditional approval and struck the condition, and after we appealed that and all the litigation shook out, it was upheld that the condition would be struck, they could build at 70. If the condition was upheld, and they came back and asked for it to be waived, you would be under no obligation to waive that condition at that point, because you would already have a decision from SHAB saying it's a reasonable condition.
So we would, it should be noted that the applicant has not asked for a waiver of section 605 without an approval of this waiver. So we would potentially have that opportunity to say, whatever this refers to, we do not grant that waiver.
You could, and if they appealed it to SHAB,
We'd have that option, okay.
you could. And if it was upheld, then the question would be, would SHAB uphold that condition? And if it did, then they couldn't come back and ask for it to be changed.
Can I just follow up on that? So if we deny and SHAB overturned, then is SHAB granting the waivers? If we deny this, there are no conditions of approval, and then, so SHAB is effectively saying, yes, you can build 70 units and grant all the waivers for the planning board.
If that happened, if they overturned the denial, SHAB would not impose any conditions on approvals.
Okay.
It would be like an approval without condition.
Okay.
So the next paragraph, since we're working on a motion for denial, the board finds that local concerns outweigh the potential benefits of the affordable units that have been proposed, and that said conditions are consistent with local needs as follows. So we need to kind of rewrite that section, because we need to specifically state that what the local concerns are and how they outweigh the affordable housing units that have been proposed.
Madam Chair, if I could just make a suggestion, since it seems like there's a majority of the board that would want to deny.
Yes.
If you like, I could make just a suggestion on what I consider to be
Sure. That's
the areas
what
that,
you're here for.
and of course, it's ultimately the board's decision. Accept it, reject it, that's fine. But with regard to the first 7 factors, A through G, that require a positive finding for approval.
Yep.
The factor that jumps out to me the most, based on the factual findings in the motion that you've been reading, is factor B, which states the proposed development is in compliance with the standards and provision of the municipality's zoning ordinance and subdivision regulations, and/or where expressly varied or waived, local concerns that have been affected by the relief granted do not outweigh the state and local need for low and moderate income housing. So the way I would look at that, if the board's inclined to deny, is that the first part of that clause, it's not in compliance, and everybody knows it's not. They've asked for waivers. the second part says, "and/or where expressly varied or waived." And I think that could tie into the prior findings about how they didn't request all the required relief, and therefore, they haven't expressly requested the waivers that they need. And then, so I just think those two things could be tied together.
And what letter were you on?
That's B of, the first set of,
First said, similar conditions are applied.
and there may be others, but that was the one that came to
That-
mind. There may be other things the board
Yes.
wants to make findings on.
Yes. Because I think that it's important for the board to specifically state where, even though we've stated earlier, but in this portion of a denial, where it's not consistent with local needs, including but not limited to the needs identified in an approved comprehensive plan and/or local ordinances, some of which have already been mentioned earlier this evening.
And I'd add to that, Madam Chair, that some of the relief, particularly the parking relief, could be considered relief towards commercial uses, in that they're being requested so that the shared parking between the apartments and the other commercial uses could get a waiver or a variance, and that that request, seeking a waiver to keep the commercial uses, doesn't outweigh enforcement of local regulations.
Everybody get that? So keeping the requirements for the commercial uses doesn't outweigh the need for affordable housing. Is that what you said? Consistency with. What else do folks feel that we need to put into inconsistency with local needs, and the inconsistency with the comprehensive plan? I know I mentioned things early on this evening, but we want to be as clear as possible.
Well, we're failing to protect the residents, neighboring
Yeah, failure to address, you said something earlier about it. It had to do with
their investment.
approved, it was, I think you said certainty and, or approved adjacent uses or something like that, an impact.
We're not going to pick that up. I'm just, again, we have
Failure
a,
to protect the reasonable expectations of the neighboring property owners in regard to privacy and mitigating the use of their private road.
Peter, is that language sufficiently
Yeah,
strong?
I think so. I think especially issues with regard to usage of the private road, that could tie into the finding about permanent access to a public street. And, I think it is fair to say issues have been raised by the abutters about whether or not they could enjoy that access. And so that's a question that the board could consider, and whether or not you can make that finding.
And that also relates to concerns for the health and safety of current residents.
And I don't know if we've really had a lot of resolution as to the water supply, whether that letter was regarding earlier development plans or.
I don't know if we have that, do we have that information on the record? Relating to water supply, adequacy of water supply.
There's water in the street and sewer in the street. There was no discussion on adequacy, other than the fact they're both available, one public, one private. Again, that would be a matter for preliminary. Conceptual is, are they available?
And we cannot comment on adequate surface water runoff because we are not at a stage that would have given us
Correct.
stormwater calculations.
Same can be said for traffic, that's typically at preliminary. They did provide it at conceptual, so I think it's on the table to discuss, but it's typically under our regulations required at preliminary.
Anything else that we need to add relative to the inconsistency with local needs, zoning ordinances, which I think have been referenced, but I just want to make sure that if they're in findings, do we need to repeat them here, or is that adequately conveyed?
So I think if there's any more comments on the first set of findings, it's probably better to address that now if there's any other comments the board have, and then you should probably move on to the second set of findings, since you have to at least hit one in each.
Anything? It seems as though the initial set of findings were very thorough with regard to the previous approval, how that came about, what the restrictions were, the role of District 5 and what the restrictions are and have been, the potential for, in terms of process, amendment of a previous plan for the district as opposed to just submission of a new plan.
I have a question. So I think we've demonstrated that it's inconsistent with 20 years of planning, but as far as inconsistent with local needs, I guess what's the local need that it's inconsistent with? The need for small business, light industry?
And also, the findings in the comprehensive plan, our subdivision regs, our local needs, our regulations are based on our comprehensive plan, and
But don't we need to be specific about which local needs this isn't consistent with?
yes. So,
It's visibility and proximity to Route 1, it being ideally located for attract passing by business. So I think that's a big piece of it. There's very little land for commercial use, and even out of that land that's available for commercial use, even a much, much smaller segment that's ideally located for those type of businesses and services.
and that actually has been proven to a certain extent by the commercial entities that are already a part of the village, South County Commons. So did you get that, Jamie?
I scold everybody for not putting their mic on, and I just got caught by Jay. I think council is advising you to look specifically at 4553-4, and in reviewing a comprehensive permit request, the local review board may deny the request for any one of the following reasons, and those are the A through E. So if you can go through each, and again, you need to find, in essence, a positive reason for denial under one or all of them, but at least one. And we're looking for clarity on which, if you can go under A, and, if the city or town has approved favorable affordable housing plan, do you have a reason to deny because you don't comply with that? Or what is your reasoning there? And then go to B and C and D and E.
So A, we can't use that finding because we don't meet that criteria with, again, significant progress is somewhat subjected, I would say.
Yeah, so I could say with regard to A, there are some terms in that are defined by statute and some that aren't. So obviously, an approved affordable housing plan is just the affordable housing plan and your comprehensive plan. Meeting housing needs is defined as, and I'll read the definition, then I'll sum it up just because there's a lot of words. But meeting housing needs is defined as adoption and implementation of the implementation program of an approved affordable housing plan in the absence of unreasonable denial of applications that are made pursuant to an approved affordable housing plan in order to accomplish the purposes and expectations of the approved affordable housing plan. So basically, I'd say meeting local housing needs means having an affordable housing plan and not unreasonably denying comp permit applications that come before you as a way of implementing the affordable housing plan. So with regard to that, first standard A, you do have an affordable housing plan in your comprehensive plan. You'd have to look back at your prior decisions and say, have we been reasonable with regard to our approvals of comp permits in the past, and put that on the record. And then you'd have to identify somewhere where this proposal is inconsistent with your affordable housing plan. And then finally, you'd have to make a finding of significant progress towards implementing that housing plan. But significant progress is not a defined term, so it would just be.
But under these requirements for denial, you can deny the request for any of the A through E, so you don't necessarily need to reference A. Even though we know we have an affordable housing plan, we've approved, 3 comprehensive permits in the last couple of years?
Yeah, correct. But I think what we're doing, if you go through this systematically, yeah.
So,
Would it also, since we're trying to support the argument that we're very much in support of affordable housing, and we've done, our actions and our decisions have been consistent with that, should we also note that we have recently made regulatory changes to make housing more affordable, including ADUs?
Yeah, I think that's all appropriate, and it's all part of your affordable housing plan.
Odd towards this.
Yeah, and I think the fact that, as the chair, Madam Chair mentioned, you've approved 3 comprehensive permit applications. I can't think of a denial that, I think if you're denying an application that's come in.
We haven't had a denial, so we can reference that, all been previously approved, and
Be your first one. Yeah. And so then the question would be significant progress towards achieving the affordable housing plan, and just put something on the record about.
so one of the things that we could reference in the progress toward achieving our affordable housing plan is the funds that have been put forward to do a design and zoning rewrite, essentially, of the Old Tower Hill Road and environment adjacent to that. And those funds have already been committed, and the RFQ has gone out, so I would suggest that that be referenced.
So that's A. As to B, consistent with local housing local needs is a defined term, and that's defined based on percentages, so it's probably, I'll read you the definition, but it's a long one. Consistent with local needs means reasonable in the view of state need for low and moderate income housing, considering with number of low-income persons in the city or town affected, and the need to protect health and safety of the occupants of the proposed housing or of the residents of the city or town, to promote better site and building design in relation to surroundings, or to preserve open space, and if the local zoning or land use ordinance requirements and regulations are applied as equally as possible to both subsidized and unsubsidized housing. So that's the initial part of the definition, which is kind of open. But then it has this part that says, local zoning and land use ordinances, requirements, or regulations are consistent with local needs when imposed by a city or town council after a comprehensive hearing in a city or town where, and then it says, lower moderate income housing exists, which is, in the case of all other cities or towns, non-urban, I skipped the other part, is in excess of 10% of the year-round housing units. So that has a definition. If you're going to say our regulations are consistent with local needs, the way they write these things is just incredibly confusing. But by saying consistent with local needs, that's referencing the 10% requirement. So,
But there's also a reference to the comprehensive plan and local zoning ordinances and so on, so
yeah,
how can that be limited per se to?
I think that's probably, the next one, C, the proposal is not in conformance with the comprehensive plan. And that's just a very general one. There's nothing defined other than you have to reference your comprehensive plan and how it's not consistent.
So as far as the comprehensive plan, obviously, the special management district, Village of South County Commons is within the comprehensive plan, the rationale for its development, and the approvals that have been, the approved uses, those are all under the SMD.
I think we could also point out that we have no verification that these will be long-term rentals, which is a need we have. It's not really providing housing.
So Peter, I'm sure you'll correct me, but it seems to me that to some extent it's appropriate that the master plan sits in for the comprehensive plan. It serves mostly all the same purposes. It's the document that we made our decisions on. It's what we've been consistent to. It's a document that provides notice to and sets the expectations for people that are investing in the area. And so I think that there's either it's directly the comprehensive plan or it sits in with the master plan for
Yeah,
decisions.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair considering the future land use map references the SMD Route 1 district. The future land use map in the comprehensive plan references the SMD, and the SMD was created through that master plan process, the application. So you could, I think it's a fair conclusion to say the reference to the SMD in the comprehensive plan is incorporating that prior approval for that overall master plan.
And early on in this document, I don't remember what page it's on, but there is a reference to the way that the SMD was created, along with the town, community. There's a reference in here somewhere to the way in which it was created. And that, I think, would be appropriate too. The SMD was created in 1998 through an extensive public-private effort between the town of South Kingstown, the developer's project team, town residents, and other related owners. Is there anything else that we're missing relative to the comprehensive plan? I mean, that it, basically, it's that special management district and the regulations that are within that district that provide the basis for our decision. The next one is not something we can use as a finding, which has to do with having met the goal of 10%. And then the last one is concerns for the environment and health and safety of current residents have not been adequately addressed. What evidence exists to support a determination that the project is not consistent with those particular local needs?
Well, they haven't defined how that road's going to work.
And inadequate,
Could you expand upon, haven't defined how that road's going to work?
yeah, that's what I'm trying,
Okay,
so.
thank you.
Like, you know,
Inadequate
school bus access,
Circulation,
maintenance.
Madam Chair, I just think it's important to remember this conceptual master plan. So that type of detail would typically get flushed out at preliminary. They would show you an idea of saying, hey, this is how we think it's going to work, and
Yeah, I don't-
prove it at the next stage.
I don't think we can
Okay.
talk necessarily about
And
school buses, but we can certainly talk about, again, reiterate the fact that we've said that the limited access roadway, not safe for pedestrians or bikes.
And how about what we've been told legally, that the association would need to sign an agreement to use that road?
I'm not sure, it seems to me that although that was brought up, I believe legal counsel told us that that would be a civil matter, and that's not within our area of jurisdiction.
Oh, I mean, that was my opinion, and it still is. I know that legal counsel for the abutters did raise that argument, and you could incorporate it if you wanted to. It is the board's ultimate decision.
Why wouldn't we?
I think it would have to be worded in a way that, that expressed the fact that the issue was raised. So the issue was raised relative to potential safety and access on a how would we put that, on a right-of-way that may be constrained or limited, or what's the best way to
Legally unavailable?
encumber?
I think you could say that counsel for the fee owner of the right-of-way has disputed whether or not there would be safe and adequate access to the parcel. And as of this date, that dispute has not been definitively resolved.
Anything else relative to concerns for the environment, health and safety? Jamie?
I would only have you look at the items we were proposing to roll into conditions of approval and see if any of those apply if they're not part of a condition. So it's on a kind of the reversal, that you needed this condition to become compliant, so are any of those conditions, by the mere fact you needed to have them, make this non-compliant?
So there was an issue brought up by the neighbors that they have people now from the hotel, guests at the hotel, walking through their neighborhoods
The-
because it's a reasonable place to walk.
Trespass issue.
Yes. So is that not something that, if you're talking about the health and safety,
I mean, I would say, any reason that the board think is a good reason is good to add. I don't think it's necessary to reach for any and all reasons that you may think are more marginal. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, and you can reject it and have a different opinion, the strongest reasons that you had have to do with the fact that the SMD wasn't addressed till very late in the process, that it did have a clear prohibition, and that there was relief that is essentially requesting for parking relief on commercial uses, and that the applicant refused to include the entire previously approved commercial district within their application in order to preserve the restaurant.
So
So
that,
I think you've hit those. Anything else is just anything you think might be a good reason.
so then we could say that this does not comply with the town's parking standards for all uses that are contained, existing, proposed, built within District 5?
I think that's a conclusion you can make.
Does not comply with Section 605-8 buffering from adjacent residential uses, which are required by regulations. Does not comply, has not, a waiver has not been requested. Does not comply with the, I'm not sure if this is, Section 605-16, bulk scale architecture from original and existing zoning requirements.
And then I think, and you've hit it through your findings, I think, just to wrap it up, and I think you've even hit it in previous findings of denial, is that they didn't comply with those, they didn't request relief from them as they should have, and they go to the commercial uses. You know,
So then, yeah, it would be the mass and the scale, the maximum, exceeded the maximum height in square footage. Does not comply with the existing conditions on the property and the existing development approvals that originally existed for District 5. I mean, I know it's repetitive, but if we have to answer these questions, then better to have them in it than not. And again, on number 2 on page 11, it's again consistent with the history and practice of development with the Village of South County Commons, wherein conceptual master plan lays out a general pattern of contemplated land uses and specific land uses with development details to integrate those uses into the surrounding development. I'm not sure that's really, I don't think that's going to be necessarily relevant. The other one is integration of units. The downstream carrying capacity, that's kind of looking forward to preliminary, so I'm not sure if that would be appropriate in this type of motion.
Yeah, traffic relates to preliminary.
The what?
The traffic relates to preliminary.
Certainly, the request was made relative to, this is, you know, the language here on 6 is weak because it said the applicant shall research. Well, they can say, we researched and we decided against it, and I mean, that's just, has no teeth to it whatsoever.
I think, Madam Chair, your language there is that strict adherence to the regulatory requirement of 605. can get the reference.
So it would be something like.
It's the requirement within the SMD that requires all residential development to be directly connected to the actual commercial space and a system of walking paths or pedestrian connections, including public spaces along those paths. The applicant didn't supply that, nor did they request a waiver.
Okay, not supplied. Okay.
Jamie, that goes back to the failure to request a waiver to 60522, I think it was?
Thank you, Brian. I was looking for that reference.
And then what about, Jamie, as far as, I mean, if it's a denial, why would we reference what we would want to see for traffic analysis at a stage of review that we, you know?
Again, that was only compliance with a condition to approve.
Okay. So that's not necessarily anything we would,
Well, the,
Do we already know the way this is going to fall out?
how could we don't have crystal balls in front of us. I mean,
Don't you need to have all of it in place? Then
So I would actually suggest that if the motion is to deny, you've made extensive findings, you made the factual findings addressing the procedure of the application and all the details that you've wanted to bring up with regard to the facts. You've reviewed the first set of factors in the statute and the second set of factors. So I think you could, at this point, make a motion based on the findings that you've discussed to deny.
Right.
If it passes, then the conditions about what comes at the next stage
Right.
really aren't in order. If it doesn't pass, then you'd have to
Right.
take a look at the steps.
We need a motion to continue here past 11.
yes, motion from Paul to continue past 11. Is there a second? Second from Joe?
I didn't say that, but
Well, you.
sure, yeah.
All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Based on our informal discussion of board members and the changes that we have made that Jamie has hopefully captured, as we discussed, we have a motion to deny based on several pages of findings.
do we want to include anything about the 7-year-old traffic study and that it really wasn't a study about this apartment building?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't think so either for denial.
Okay.
It just didn't act to further support the use that we're denying anyway.
Mm.
So I mean, it's a good point, but. All right, so. No.
So,
Well, staff, we're out of time, so I don't think the staff can prepare something for us to vote on at a future date.
so I think at this point, the vote would be to deny. Jamie has the notes.
Yes.
He could draft up a decision, and so there are boards that regularly follow this procedure, and they don't look at a draft before they vote on it, and that's kind of where you are now.
Right.
So I think what you would do is you'd vote to deny based on the conversation. Jamie would draft it up. He'd show it to the chair to show it was accurate, and if the chair concluded it was, she would sign the decision, and that would be the decision. So the vote tonight would just be vote to deny, motion to deny based on the findings you just made, incorporating all that, and you have a vote on it.
We haven't-
Once we have a motion.
Right.
On the floor, then we have comments.
So just for giggles, I'm going to go ahead and make the original motion.
I think that Joe was, I
I'm
think that
sorry.
Joe was going to make the motion that we just are discussing right now, right?
I am. I think Paul from procedural area wants to make that motion to approve, and maybe I guess it get denied, and then.
We've just
we don't
spent
Bring a second motion.
2 hours,
I don't want to
2 hours
deny
going
him the
through this.
opportunity if he wants to, well, I guess you.
I mean, that's just,
That's fine.
All right, I'll make a motion. I make a motion that the South Kingstown Planning Board disapproves the proposed changes to the conceptual master plan, as well as the District 5 lower moderate income housing project. I make that based on the findings of fact contained within the draft motion and as amended and added to, based on tonight's discussion. With the final review of that being done by the chairman and informational copies being provided to the board after the fact for informational purposes.
we have a motion from Joe. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second from Liz.
Madam Chair, just for clarity, Mr. Murphy used the terminology disapproves.
Denied.
So the motion, the intent is to deny the application that was submitted as amended.
Yes, with those findings of fact as amended and added to, and the final review of that motion to be done by the chairman, and then informational copies be provided to the planning board members.
So we have a motion from Joe. We have a second from Liz. Is there further discussion? This is your opportunity, folks.
There's nothing about this project that I am truly in favor of. However, I'm a little nervous about a flat-out denial, because an appeal to SHAB, they'll build the whole thing, or have the potential to build 70-unit apartment building without buffering, without looking at traffic, without looking at drainage, with all the things that we're fighting for. And it's a big gamble. And I'm not myself a gambler, and I appreciate that maybe some other folks are, but I hear every single one of the problems with this application, and I was a strong denier up until I really sat and thought about how this might play out if we lose this in appeal. If they take all the parking for the building, and then there's none for the hotel, and it's not going to be good for anybody. So I'm nervous about what we have to lose if they appeal and we lose that.
Thanks, Susan.
I wouldn't say that I'm nervous about the appeal. I think it will be whatever it will be. I still think that, as I said earlier, it's not the worst project we've seen, and the need for housing, at least among the people that I talk to, is a big deal in this town. But, I'm one of however many we are these days, so I'm fine with whatever we do.
I just want to say that I think the planning board and staff in particular has been very thorough in looking at this project from the very beginning. I worry that we should not be making decisions based on fear of SHAB. There are going to be appeals potentially. We don't have any control over that. We know that we have heard many, many times from applicants that if you don't approve this as submitted, we're going to appeal to SHAB. Sometimes in some of the other projects, first of all, it's been allowed use. It's been within a residential district. This is not the case here. Secondly, many other applicants have been willing to have conversations, so to speak, and allowed potential changes to an application that have made it better. Maybe not 100% or what we feel is in the interest of good planning, but we've at least had the conversation. This has not been the case in this project at all. So it's been a very frustrating project, and South County, the Village of South County Commons has multiple uses. As stated earlier, it was originally designed to not be primarily residential, but to be a good, healthy mix of commercial and light industrial. As has been previously stated, there already are significant residential uses within the district. It's unfortunate that some of those were developed prior to inclusionary zoning, so that wasn't a factor here. However, as previously stated, we've also made or making an effort from a planning perspective and a financial perspective in this community to move forward with a rezoning and design element standards for Old Tower Hill Road. That will include true mixed use. This has taken many years to get moving forward. It's had support from the planning board, from the town council, and the economic development committee, and I feel that that demonstrates a commitment to affordable housing and having it integrated into neighborhoods and having true mixed use rather than segregated uses. Anyone else? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Nays?
Nay.
Nay.
4 ayes, 2 nays. Motion carries. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Jamie and his staff, though, for putting all of this together and doing the incredible amount of research that were part of findings regardless of whether the project was approved or denied. Those are all really relevant and required a lot of homework and a lot of time and effort. Motion to adjourn. So moved. Motion for Joe, second.
Second?
Second from Paul. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries.